and welcome back to Sunday Seminary Online. I'm Brennan Breed. I am going to be finishing our study of Jeremiah this week as part of our larger study of the prophets of the Exile. So Jeremiah and Ezekiel and 2nd Isaiah. So next week we're going to jump into Ezekiel, which will be exciting, new territory. But for this week we're going to wrap up the book of Jeremiah. So we're going to cover the section from chapters 46 through 52, which is often called the oracles against the nations. And this is something that Jeremiah shares with the other prophets of the Bible. We'll talk about what the oracles of the nations are, but we'll also talk about the confusing kind of pile up of endings for the book of Jeremiah, and we'll wrap up a bit about what Jeremiah teaches us as a whole. Of course, there's a million small lessons that the book of Jeremiah tells us, but we'll take a look at the overall kind of shape and potential meanings for the book. So again, working through Jeremiah here, we're gonna leave this fascinating, spunky and sometimes dour prophet, a prophet who internalizes and then externalizes his own grief, his own suffering and trauma, and in some ways serves as kind of a model for us, but for the people who move through trauma, about how to be honest with ourselves about what's happened, how to express that and express the grief of ourselves and try to help other people express their own grief as they move through it. But also to think carefully about God's judgment against us, God's judgment against the ways that we live, our priorities, the ways that we've hurt others, God's judgment against our leadership, against the systems that undergird our world, and also against others. The oracles against the nations is what we'll talk about today, that God is not limited to just us or our community, whoever that is, whoever us is, but that God is a cosmic God who's interested in the whole universe and is interested in all of humanity, and is interested in interacting with and calling for justice with all of humanity. So, in any event, that we'll jump in here. Let me just talk to you a bit and put this up here just to kind of show a brief outline of the book of Jeremiah. So if I'm going to break it up into parts, and this might be familiar to you if you have been following along with the study, because these are basically the weeks that I have divided our study into. So this is, every week I would take a kind of a different chunk of the book. They don't match up exactly, but almost exactly. So chapter 1, that's Jeremiah's call, which I'm going to reference in just a minute. But if you don't remember, this is Jeremiah talking to God, and Jeremiah's call that is repeated several times throughout the book. It's kind of a refrain of the book. God says, "See, I have appointed you over nations and over kingdoms." Now, not a nation and a kingdom, that meaning Judah, but nations and kingdoms. And that's where we come into that part today, where Jeremiah talks to those other nations. To pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. Remember those 6 verbs that sum up Jeremiah's mission, the first 4, about unbuilding or undoing. We've talked a bit over the last few weeks about why it is that God would want to unbuild anything or undo anything, and it seems like God is angry or upset or evil, even sometimes to some people, that God is doing these things that are terrifying and terrible. But it's in the interest of unbuilding so that there can be new life, new building, new systems, new orders, new ways that we live personally and corporately. But so that's the building and the planting, those last 2. And you can, in some way, kind of divide up the book this way about plucking up and pulling down. In a way, that's chapters 1 through 25. The kind of part of the book that's really about the falling apart of Judah and Jerusalem. And then you have this part that's about building up, and that's really kind of chapters 29 through 33. There's a bit kind of you can find elsewhere in the book about this, but that kind of matches up in a way. And if we look a little bit more closely at the outline, chapters 2 through 10 are a discussion, a poetic description, a witnessing to, you might say, the judgment that God has against Judah and the reasoning that God has behind this. We talked about how chapters 2 through 4 focus on this idea of the broken household metaphor, that in the covenant God had married, in a way, Israel, but that Israel had been unfaithful to that relationship by trying to live like the nations around them. And then also chapters 4 through 10 are a poetic description of the foe from the north, which is not even named in this section. It's Babylon, of course, but it's kind of so haunting in a way that Jeremiah can't even bring himself to say the name. And it's a description of the tragedy that's going to strike Jerusalem and the unbuilding process, which is terrifying both to God and to Jeremiah. Chapter 7 is the temple sermon, where Jeremiah lays out in very clear terms what the problem is. And the problem is that the people of Jerusalem, especially the leadership, and the people of Judah, especially the leadership of Judah, did not follow the covenant, and primarily they did not build a culture, a community, a society that sought to take care of the vulnerable, the orphans, the widows, the children, to take care of those people who could not take care of themselves, those people who needed the community. This is kind of the vision of the new community that Yahweh wanted to build, and that the people built a different way. They built a way that centered power and money and structures of violence and so on. And so God said, I'm going to unbuild this. That's basically the core call of that. And then chapters 11 through 25, these include Jeremiah's confessions, or kind of Jeremiah's lamentations, his weeping, where Jeremiah confesses to God a lot of things, not just his own sin and the sin of the people, but primarily his anger at God, his frustrations with God, his feeling abandoned by God and neighbor, and describing kind of the collapse of the world being a collapse also for Jeremiah himself. His hopes, his dreams, his security, his sense of identity. And this, in a way, is emblematic for the people of Judah as a whole. And it's kind of a script, in a way, for people to try to help themselves confess their anger and their frustrations and their rage even to God. Sometimes bluntly so. Remember, Jeremiah says, God, you're a broken, you've broken your promises. You're like a lying stream, and God, you're a liar, is what Jeremiah says in chapter 15. Remember, God doesn't throw lightning bolts or get mad at Jeremiah. Instead, God reasserts the promise, reasserts Jeremiah's call. And then we had the bits about Jeremiah's run-ins with authorities. Remember, he gets in fights and scrapes with different prophets and also with kings. And then we had Jeremiah's book of consolation. The oracles of salvation that promise good things. There's also, I forgot to mention it, in chapters 11 through 25, there's also sections, especially chapters 21 through 25, where Jeremiah kind of describes it, stories, really, narratives of Jeremiah's run-ins with the authorities. It's a bit in Jeremiah's prophecies against, especially kings, that kind of preface, in a way, Jeremiah's run-ins with the authorities. But then, as I said, in chapters 30 through 33, chapter 29 is the letter to the exiles, which is, sometimes people put that in the book of consolation, even though chapter 30 says this is the beginning of the book of consolations, right? So in any event, the letter doesn't really belong with that, but I mean, sometimes people would put 29 in with 30 through 33 as part of the oracles of hope and salvation. But the actual part that's called the book of consolation, which includes the new covenant, is in chapters 30 through 33. And this is the upbuilding part, the promises that God will upbuild. And then we get those stories that we talked about last week, and that's Jeremiah as the ideal survivor, that he survives all these traumatic incidents with the authorities where they try to kill him, put him on death row. We talked about Micah. We talked about the story of Baruch and the scroll in chapter 36, which is kind of amazing. I'll mention that again a little bit later here. And then we get to the part where we're at this week. That's the oracles against the nations. This part where and I'll explain what an oracle against a nation is and why these exist. But it's a collection of oracles against surrounding nations that have really two important features to them. But then there's this very end, which is this story that is taken almost straight out of, it's edited a bit, but it's taken almost straight out of the book of 2 Kings. And it describes the end of the city of Jerusalem, the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in 587 BC. So this is, and then the book kind of ends with that. So in any event, That's the structure of the book as a whole, and you can kind of see the whole thing now. And one thing I'm going to point out, and I have another slide for this later on, is that this looks like the end right here, but actually there's a number of endings to the book of Jeremiah that are clear endings, and we'll kind of work our way backwards through some of those. But first, the oracles against the nations. So if you turn to chapter 46, you'll see that 45, what we ended with last time, is this kind of word to Baruch, right? That you are the scribe, I'm going to be with you wherever you go. And then we get this big shift in chapter 46, and we focus on Egypt, and it says, the word of the Lord that came to the prophet Jeremiah concerning the nations. Now, remember at the beginning, Jeremiah is said to prophesy over kings and nations, but really he's only spoken to Judah so far in the book. Here is where he's going to speak about these. Now, this is a really interesting thing and a strange thing about the book of Jeremiah, is that there are actually different ancient versions of the book of Jeremiah. It used to be that biblical scholars thought that somebody somewhere along the line messed up and wrote a bad copy of the book of Jeremiah. And that became the basis for the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew book of Jeremiah, called the Septuagint. And then that became the foundation for early Christian use of the Old Testament. That is, early Christians tended to use the Greek version of the Old Testament. And then Jerome, who's a biblical scholar and monk who lived somewhere around the end of the 300s and beginning of the 400s AD, Jerome translated the Old Testament using somewhat Hebrew texts. And so noticed some big differences. And notice that Jeremiah was about 20% longer. And in fact, he wasn't the first one to notice this. An earlier biblical scholar who was a Christian who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, named Origen, figured this out earlier, but still, I'll use Jerome for the purposes of this analogy to say Jerome notices that Jeremiah is 20% longer in the Hebrew, the ancient Hebrew version, than it is in the Greek version. So it's longer. We're missing 20% of Jeremiah, is what Jerome says. And Jerome says, we got to kind of add some of the stuff back in. So he translates a longer version of Jeremiah. For a long time, people thought that the Greek translator had gotten kind of bored with Jeremiah and cut out 20% or something like that. In fact, now based on the Dead Sea Scrolls, they've been discovered, and people found Hebrew versions that match up with the Greek version, that is, shorter versions of Jeremiah in Hebrew. And what we can see is that the ancient Hebrew version of Jeremiah, what you'll find if you open up, say, like a NRSV or really any Protestant Bible, these are all based on Jerome's kind of choices about what parts of books to keep in and leave out and so on, and which base versions to use. He ended up using the Masoretic text version, or the ancient Hebrew version, and this means that we have the 20% longer version of Jeremiah. One other big difference is that this part of the book, the Oracles Against the Nations, is in a different part of the book. It's ordered a different way in the Hebrew text than it is in the Greek text. So Jerome ends up putting kind of the end of Jeremiah, it looks to many Christians like he takes the middle of Jeremiah and puts it at the end. Now, the place where these go is an interesting question. We have two ancient versions. At the time of Jesus, there were two different Hebrew versions of the book of Jeremiah. One was longer than the other, and one had the oracles against the nations in a different place. Which one's right? I don't know. Maybe they're both right in their own way. But all to say that it does something different where these are. So when we read Ezekiel, we'll see that the oracles against the nations go in the middle of the book of Ezekiel. In the book of Isaiah, the oracles against the nations are kind of scattered throughout in a way, but there is a section of them kind of near the beginning, but after the judgments against Israel and Judah. So what we can see is that over time there seems to have been at least one tradition that put these oracles against the nations after the judgments against Israel and Judah and before the oracles of salvation. But in Jeremiah, in the Masoretic text version, which is what I'm looking at right now, the oracles against the nations come at the end. It kind of does change the meaning of the book. So what's an oracle against the nation? Well, an oracle against the nation is when a prophet speaks to foreign nations and says something that Yahweh has to say to them. The presupposition is that we have no evidence for this exactly, but the presupposition is that this is an old thing, that prophets would speak in the name of their God to other nations and say, my God's going to beat your God, etc. They would say that stuff all the time. And in Israel, This was probably a common occurrence. The earliest record we have of this in the Bible is in the book of Amos, and Amos seems to parody the oracles against the nations. So it's like the earliest form we have is like him making fun of the way other people use these things. Does that make sense? So it's kind of a funny thing. It's like, what if you, I don't know, the earliest song you ever heard was like you could find if you were an archaeologist from the future and like you were digging and trying to find ancient culture. Let's say you're from the year 20,000, and you come back in time and you dig up stuff from the year 2000 and you find like only like Weird Al Yankovic tapes, you'd be like, well, they listen to silly songs all the time. Well, no, those are parodies of other songs, right? Amos is the earliest prophetic book we have, and Amos's use of the oracles against the nation seems to be almost silly. Not silly exactly, but it's a parody. That is to say, it seems, based on the way Amos uses it, that lots of other prophets were using oracles against the nations to say that Yahweh is going to destroy you because Yahweh loves Israel. It's kind of like a nationalist use of religion, right? To say like, my God has told me that our country is the best and we're going to dominate you all because you all stink, right? That seems to be the way that these things worked. And Amos, if you read Amos chapters 1 and 2, he seems to be speaking to a bunch of Israelites at a pilgrimage festival, like a big festival, everyone's there, at the Temple of Bethel, which is a major temple of the northern kingdom of Israel. He seems to be speaking sometime around the year 750 BC. A time when the northern kingdom was doing great after the split between northern and southern kingdoms. And Amos is addressing all these people, and Amos says, hey, God said that those Moabites are going to get it. Now I've got a map over here so you can see where like Israel's up there in the blue, and then Judah is in the pink below it. The Philistine city-states are in the red next to the kingdom of Judah. Edom is down below. Moab is above Edom. Ammon is above Moab on the Transjordan, or on the other side of the Jordan River from the center of the kingdom of Israel. And then if you look up at the very top, there's Aram, or Aram Damascus. So Aram is the people, Arameans. They speak Aramaic. Damascus is their major city. But in any event, so Aram, Damascus, same people. Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistines. And then at the very, very top, on the top kind of northwestern side of this map, right on the Mediterranean Sea, you see the Phoenician states, like Tyre and Sidon. And so on. So in any event, these are the kind of neighbors of Israel. And what's fascinating about Amos is like, yeah, the Moabites are going to get it. And, the people are like, yes. And then, Amos would say, hey, the Arameans are going to get it. Yeah, all right. The Ammonites are going to get it. Yes. The Philistines are going to get it. Yes. The Edomites are going to get it. Yes. And then Amos says, and the Israelites are going to get it. That's us, because we have broken the covenant with God. We've not done what God wanted. Actually, he says that the Judahites have broken the covenant, and the kingdom of Israel has even done worse. The kingdom of Israel has treated their own people like they're going to war against them. The kings have declared war against the people by impoverishing them and making them into debt slaves, is in fact what Amos says. So Amos is using these oracles against the nations really to point out a problem within Israel. Other prophets seem to kind of use these in different ways. Many times, the oracles against the nations, in Jeremiah, this is the way it is. In Ezekiel, we see this too. They end up being kind of a condemnation of the other nations for the ways that they have enacted judgment on Israel. So it's kind of funny, but it's like a two-step dance. The first step is that Yahweh says, I'm going to unbuild Jerusalem. I'm going to call on some of these nearby peoples, especially in the book of Jeremiah. I'm going to call on Babylon to undo and deconstruct Jerusalem. And Edomites and Moabites, it seems, at least according to Jeremiah, they jump in and join in the fun and destroy Jerusalem alongside in an alliance with the Babylonians. And then God says, I'm going to, and Aram has for a long time, and the Philistines have for a long time, taken advantage of Jerusalem, especially after the destruction. They kind of take stuff, take land, and so, so all to say that the oracles against the nations seem to say, these other nations around, so Egypt, you're going to get it because you tempted Israel and Judah, really here in Jeremiah. You tempted Judah to betray their covenant with God and to go after the Egyptians. Remember, Jeremiah's whole message is Babylon's going to dominate this region. Yahweh has declared it. This gives us a chance to reorganize, to redo things. It's kind of a reset button for us, but we need to submit. And if we don't submit, we're going to get destroyed. Egypt was the main temptation, right? And we're going to ally with the Egyptians, and that's going to help us beat the Babylonians. And Jeremiah says, hey, listen, Egypt's going to get it. And then Babylon is going to be the tool that's going to strike Egypt. So we see this as kind of a repeated pattern, that Babylon is going to enact God's justice on Jerusalem, and then Babylon's going to enact God's justice on all the people who tempted it or also helped in the destruction of Jerusalem. So you can look at chapter 47, judgment on the Philistines. That God is going to judge these nations around. So Pharaoh attacked Gaza, whatever. So these foreign nations are kind of attacking each other and doling out God's justice as well. Judgment on Moab, chapter 48. Moab joined in and tried to destroy Jerusalem. They allied with Babylon in order to destroy Jerusalem. And they're going to be taken apart too. They're going to be taken apart by Babylon, their former friends. And the Ammonites, chapter 49, they joined in the fun, and they're going to pull down Jerusalem. And after that, the Babylon is going to destroy Ammon. And then Edom, same thing. Edom joined in the destruction of Jerusalem. And the ones that they trusted in, Babylon, are going to unbuild them as well, in Damascus, and so on. And then finally you get to chapter 50, and then you get judgment on Babylon. Chapters 50 and 51 focus on the judgment against Babylon itself. So God uses Babylon as a tool to judge the nations around, and then God turns around and says to Babylon, you did more than I said you should do, right? I mean, you went further, and you did all these awful things, and you have yourself been a tool of oppression. So now it's time to unbuild you. And then, of course, later comes Persia, the ones that undo Babylon, but we don't actually read about them in particular here. We just read about the destruction of the Babylonian kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. So Babylon itself actually comes out unscathed they surrender, the Babylonian people surrender to King Cyrus of Persia, and they go down without a fight, which saves the city of Babylon. But its kingdom is removed from it. And then, of course, there's what we call the Persian period, which is a period of restoration, right? The people of the exile are given leave to go home, at least some of them. That's another story for another day. But for here, there's one thing that repeats in these oracles of judgment against the nations within Jeremiah that's really fascinating too. Just as an example, look at the Moabites in chapter 48. There's this long series of poems and prose judgments upon all these people for doing all these awful things to Jerusalem, and a condemnation of their god, Chemosh, and so on. But if you look at the very end, God's going to do all this terrible stuff. And then verse 47 of chapter 48, yet I will restore the fortunes of Moab in the latter days, said the Lord. Thus far is the judgment on Moab. So thus far, like the end, there's going to be an end to the judgment on Moab, and then something else is going to come. God is going to restore the Moabites. And then in chapter 49, concerning the Ammonites, if you look at the verse 6 of chapter 49, so there's terrible stuff God's going to do against the Ammonites. If you look there at the kingdom of Ammon, just north of the kingdom of Moab, verse 6, but afterwards I will restore the fortunes of the Ammonites, says the Lord. So Yahweh is going to restore that. Now, this is kind of a fundamental claim throughout the Bible, is that instead of being a nationalist God, this is part of Amos's big claim of using the oracles against the nations, Yahweh's not a nationalist God just fighting for the good of Israel. Yahweh is a global God, a cosmic God, struggling for the good of the universe. And Yahweh has given Israel a special relationship, a special call, in order to work alongside the mission of God to bring fullness of life to all the earth. And this is like the precondition for joining in. And there's a couple amazing things in Amos, right? So against this kind of nationalistic vision of God, if you turn to Amos chapters 1 and 2, I just encourage you to read those. But Amos chapter 9 includes one of the most shocking things in all of the Bible. Amos chapter 9, verse 7. Are you not like the Ethiopians to me, O people of Israel, says Yahweh? Did I not bring Israel up from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir? I'm going to read that again. Aren't you like the Ethiopians to me, O people of Israel, says the Lord? Didn't I bring Israel up from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir? So Ethiopia, Israel, Philistines, and Arameans are all said to be the same to God. God did the same thing for all of them. And what is that? Well, Israel came up from Egypt. That's the Exodus, right? Egypt was had conquered them in some way, and they were delivered to a new land and given space to live. And then also God did that same thing for the Philistines from a place called Kaftor, which is the Greek island that they came from, that they sailed from, and landed on what's now the Gaza Strip, and formed a new nation, a group of city-states. And then the same thing, the Arameans from Kir. We don't actually know where Kir was, but there's a story that the Arameans tell that they came from a place called Kir, and that they were delivered into the land of Syria, where they flourished. So they, deliverance from a place of struggle, of oppression, etc., of death. For the Philistines, they were dying on this island of Kaftor because there was no water, no food, and they were delivered to a place that gave them life. So Yahweh has done this. That's the claim of Amos. So you're not chosen in order to relax on your laurels or to use this as a way to puff yourself up and lord it over other people or dominate them. You've been chosen to do the kind of work that God does all over the cosmos, which is the work of deliverance, of giving a space for people to live and breathe and have their being and so on, and to have life and have it to the full, right? So to quote John. In Amos chapter 3, there's another thing here. Amos chapter 3, verse 2, you only have I known of all the families of the earth. See, that's the language of election. I chose you out of all the languages, of all the peoples of the earth. You're so super special. You only have I known from all the families of the earth, and then therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities. You're elected to the mission. And if you hurt other people, you're not part of the mission anymore, right? That's and then God's going to not punish you in terms of chalk it up on your eternal, kind of credit card score or something. God's going to punish you in the sense that God's going to do what God did to Pharaoh. If you become Pharaoh, God's going to unbuild you just like God unbuilt Pharaoh. That seems to be the message of Jeremiah overall. But also it fits in with this kind of larger message of the oracles against the nations throughout, which is the nations aren't just something God's mad at. God is interested in the flourishing of all of these people too. It's central to God's identity and God's mission. Yahweh wants to be the God of the whole universe. When I say wants to be, Yahweh wants to be lauded as Lord of the universe by all the peoples of the world, according to Jeremiah, but especially according to Isaiah, kind of envisions this as a future day, and so on. So when we look at chapter 49, verse 6, there's judgment against the Ammonites, but the purpose of this all is to restore the fortunes, is to restore them as a people. So the unbuilding stuff is part of the building up. And then Edom, you can see that there's actually not as much of a kind of positive ending to Edom, and that's in part because the Edomites are depicted several times in the Bible as being central to the destruction of Jerusalem's temple, especially. Psalm 77 seems to go into detail on this and other places in the Bible, but all to say that's kind of a troubling part. You can even look at chapter 49, verse 34. Elam, a place that becomes part of the Persian Empire, but is not identical to the Persian Empire. It's kind of the pre-Persian, it's the areas, some of the areas like Susa that become part of central to the Persian Empire, but it's this different people, different kingdom that existed during the time of Babylon's reign. You can see, God has judgment against Elam, but then in verse 39, in the latter days I will restore the fortunes of Elam. So this might be kind of a gesture towards the Persian Empire, which seems to have kind of a much more positive depiction in the Bible, especially in the prophets, than the Babylonian Empire does. Even though Babylon was a tool of God's judgment, Babylon also receives a ton of invective for the way they carried it out, that they went too far, and that they were rapacious in their destructions. So in any event, then in chapters 50 and 51, we see this judgment on Babylon, and this is a big part of why kind of Babylon takes on this larger, almost cosmic significance, rather than just being one of the cities that happened to dominate Jerusalem at one time. A bit like why isn't Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, why isn't that depicted as the center of all evil, like Babylon is, or something like that? In part it's because Babylon was in charge when the temple was destroyed, when the exile occurred, but also it's in part because of chapters like this, and also Isaiah 13 and 14, which I'll mention later. Those are kind of taunt songs against the king of Babylon. So I'm not going to read in detail this kind of description of the destruction of Babylon and the oracles against it, but just to know that this is cathartic for the people of Jerusalem who have suffered through the destruction of their own city. To hear that God cares. This is a way to hear, so let's say someone tries to attack my family or something. Part of the way I express my love for them is to defend them. So the oracles against the nations are bad news to these nations quite often, and then there's this uptick of hope, usually of good news, that comes at the very end of these. But it's there's bad news to these nations, but that's in a way good news to Israel and to Jerusalem, because it shows that God has changed. What God is doing now is defending Jerusalem and defending the people of Judah against the attacks of those who formerly were being used as tools of judgment. So it marks a shift in God's relationship to these foreign peoples. So God's going to do right, and Babylon is its doom is foretold. And in fact, there's a little narrative here, chapter 51, verses 59 through 64. The brother of Baruch, this guy named Sariah, son of Neriah, son of Maaseiah. So he goes with Zedekiah to Babylon. Now this is probably, it says this in the 4th year of Zedekiah's reign. So this puts it sometime around 593 BC or so. And what probably happened was, Jehoiachin rebels in 597 and is taken into exile. Jerusalem's not destroyed in 597. The king's in exile. There's a new king put on the throne, that's Zedekiah. Zedekiah seems to be a part of some kind of almost rebellion. It's covered in chapter 27 of Jeremiah. And there's a serious problem. And so Zedekiah may have had to go to Babylon to kind of plead his case in a way. And so Sariah seems to have gone with him. And on their way to Babylon to plead their case, please don't destroy Jerusalem, Jeremiah, verse 60 of chapter 51 of Jeremiah. Jeremiah wrote in a scroll, that's probably Baruch writing in the scroll, right? Whatever. Jeremiah says it. All the disasters that would come on Babylon, all these words that were written concerning Babylon. So that is chapters 50 and 51. And Jeremiah said to Sariah, when you come to Babylon, see that you read all these words and say, O Yahweh, you yourself threaten to destroy this place so that neither human beings nor animals shall live in it. See chapters 50 and 51 of Jeremiah. And it should be desolate forever. When you it doesn't happen, right? People still live in Baghdad today, but nonetheless, the idea is that it will not have dominion. When you finish reading the scroll, tie a stone to it, throw it into the middle of the Euphrates River, that is the river that goes through Babylon, and say, thus shall Babylon sink and rise no more. So it's a sign act, right? He's going to write these oracles, tie a rock to them, say something, throw them into the water, and it's going to enact in a way, bring forth the prophecy itself. Thus shall Babylon sink to rise no more because of the disasters that I am bringing on her. So this is, it's kind of a, it's a symbol or a sign, but also it's supposed to kind of open up. It's supposed to kind of begin the process of the undoing of Babylon. But it's going to take a long time. Remember, Jeremiah's other letter says, hey, it's going to take generations, right? So it's kind of the beginning of this process. And then it says, thus far are the words of Jeremiah. So it's an ending. But then we get more. We get chapter 52, which is the destruction of Jerusalem reviewed. And this is taken from, we've shifted now from the oracles against the nations to something else. We would call this part of the Deuteronomistic history. Okay, so the Deuteronomistic history is the bunch of books starting with Joshua, so Joshua and then Judges. We're going to skip Ruth because Ruth doesn't seem to fit within this group of texts for a few different reasons. But so Joshua and Judges, and then 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then 1st and 2nd Kings. If you read them all together, they end up being kind of a narrative, that tells one story, the story of the people's entry into and exit from the land. And they all seem to bear the marks of someone's editing. So that is to say that they seem to they have lots of different source material that comes from different times and places. But someone has kind of constructed this at the point of Israel's exile. Someone's constructed it into one overarching narrative with, kind of language that ties everything together. So we have a narrator that says some things that are similar. We have characters giving big speeches that kind of repeat some of the same things over and over, which seems to kind of have this one big overarching idea. And chapter 52 of Jeremiah is taken from 2 Kings 25, basically. There's a couple of things added, a couple of things taken away, but somebody has definitely kind of moved this piece of text over here. Now, it's really interesting because chapter 25 of 2 Kings had to have been written after the exile. I mean, so in the exile, right? During the time of the exile. It's before they've come back to the land, but King Jehoiachin is apparently alive, but he's also after this point in time where he's been given this special rations from the king's table. And that's the way 2 Kings ends. It's this little tiny note of hope at the end of a book that's really about kind of dealing with the disaster of being kicked out of the land that was promised. So that's been stuck on to the end of Jeremiah, which is really, really interesting. So it does something, I think, a bit different in Jeremiah than it does at the end of 2 Kings. That is, it focuses us in a very different, because Jeremiah has been exceedingly critical of the kings throughout, but then ending with Jehoiachin receiving a bit of mercy from the king of Babylon, which has been described as God's tool throughout, right? So you can see this is kind of like God's grace in a way, giving the king an extra bit of rations and a bit of freedom, but he's still in exile. So this royal ending gives this note of subtle hope for Jehoiachin and for Jehoiachin's return, or at least the return of another king at some point. And this is part of the kind of transition of the idea of a Messiah, or in Hebrew, a Meshiach, one who is anointed from the verb mashach, to anoint. So to have oil poured over you, which really sets you aside for God's special use. So the whole point there is that within Jeremiah, there's kind of this refashioning of the Davidic covenant, you might say, refashioning of, or at least hope that there is going to be a return of structure, order, the promises to Jerusalem and to the king, and a reforming of all of those things in accordance with what Jeremiah's been saying the whole time. So there's this kind of slight note of hope. But as I said, this seems to have been added on at a later date, sometime well into the exile, after somebody had gotten their hands on a finished copy of the Deuteronomistic history, that is, the Book of Kings. Somebody's taken the end of it off and kind of adapted it to Jeremiah, which is really interesting. But especially that verses 31 through 34, that's just taken from 2 Kings, and it's it's there to give this kind of note of hope in the restoration of the kingdom and king. And this is part of that transition to the idea of a Messiah that we think about with Jesus, where it wasn't just a king set aside, a typical king set aside for God's special use, etc., or a priest or something, anyone who's had oil anointed on them as part of their ordination or coronation. And this is part of a shift to a different way of using that title, someone who's going to fix everything in a way. So, but then you look, and there's another ending there. Verses 28 through 30 are interesting because we got these it's an addition here. Verses 28 through 30 are not found in 2 Kings. So someone's added this in, and if you just look at it, and I'm actually going to go back to the end of verse 27. So chapter 52 of Jeremiah, verse 27, the king of Babylon struck them down, put them to death at Ribla in the land of Hamath. So Judah went into exile out of its land. This is the number of people whom Nebuchadnezzar took into exile. In the 7th year, 3,023 Judeans. In the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar took into exile from Jerusalem 830 persons. In the 23rd year of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, took into exile of the Judeans 745 persons. All the persons were 4,600. So this is kind of trying to account for all the peoples that were taken away, which is actually different from all the other lists. It's a bit unclear exactly how many people were taken into exile. All to say that the land was not totally empty. But the important thing here is that you hear exile, exile, exile. The exile, they were taken away from the land, they were taken away from the land, they were taken away from the land, they were taken away from the land. Now we know that Jeremiah ends up in Egypt, and he was telling people to stay in the land. But this is, again, just this kind of repeat, exile, 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 exile. And so that functions kind of as an ending. Someone stuck that there. Someone added that in to be an ending. And somehow it ended up here, stuck into the middle of this part that was taken from 2 Kings to be another ending. Fascinating, right? So we have the kind of starting at the very end of what we now have as the book of Jeremiah, and working our way backwards. We have this royal ending of Jehoiachin receiving an extra ration from the king, and in a way kind of gesturing at hope. Before that, we have the exile, 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 kind of a note of doom in a way. And then before that, if you look at chapter 51, verses 59 through 64, this kind of functions as an end. And in fact, it says the end. Thus far, the words of Jeremiah, that's the clearest way to say the end in ancient Hebrew as you could possibly find. So the fact that there's anything after that is amazing. This is an end to the book of Jeremiah. Somebody ended it here, and someone else said that's not the end. So Babylon's destruction, someone said that's the end. Someone else said, the exile, that's the end. And someone else said, there's hope. That's the end. And you can kind of even find other endings before this. Somebody probably ended this at chapter 45 before. That is to say, we have this other version of Jeremiah that might be older, that's shorter, right? That 20% shorter version. Somebody added 20% to the book. So this older version seems to have the oracles against the nations kind of in the middle of the book, after really chapter 25. So all to say that chapter 45 seems to be the ending, an ancient ending of the book as well, before all this other stuff got added, and before the oracles against the nations got moved to the ending. So chapter 45, think about this as an ending to the book. So it's Baruch, the scribe, who's being told, I'm going to be with you, kind of like Moses. I'm going to be with you. You're the new Moses. I'm going to, verse 4 in chapter 45, thus you shall say to him, thus says the Lord, I'm going to break down what I built, pluck up what I have planted, that is the whole land. This is like the message to Jeremiah. It's almost like the message to the prophets gets shifted onto the scribes. That is, we're seeing a shift in this religion of kind of like the spoken word to a religion of the text, of the book, which becomes the definitive identity of Judaism and of Christianity later. So in verse 5, and you do not seek the great things for yourself. I will give you your life as a prize of war in every place which you may go. So the scribe is going to carry forth, and think of this way, the text, the voice of the text being the voice of the scribe, which is different from the voice of the prophet. It's now the voice of God that is going to go everywhere throughout the world, and it's going to kind of spread God's message to the ends of the earth, right? That's kind of an amazing, shocking ending. This would have been a really surprising thing for ancient peoples for whom written documents were really kind of a spark to oral memory and were kind of a prompt to public performance. So all to say, this kind of shift to like the text being the thing. This is where God is located in a way, is in this text. This is where the word of the Lord is located, in texts that we interpret together in communities. This presages what happens, what we would say in the Persian period, or the time of return, when Ezra and Nehemiah, in those books, where Ezra comes back. This is in the book of Nehemiah, where Ezra comes back from exile and brings with him a big book and reads it to everyone and says, this is the law of God. And people say, whoa, this is crazy. I haven't heard this stuff before. And they interpret it together. That seems to be a shift really towards this religion in the book. And Baruch is kind of this mediating figure of drastic change that's going to take place to a text-based religion, a religion of the book, which really kind of opens up God's presence, not just to certain times and places where people heard from God, but to anyone who can read or who can hear or can engage in these texts. So then we can say there's one more ending, even before that. In chapter 36, many more similar. So Jeremiah took a scroll, he wrote in all the words. If you look at chapter 36 of Jeremiah, verse 32, Jeremiah took another scroll and gave it to the secretary Baruch son of Neriah. Remember, this is the story where the king is kind of cutting up the text of Jeremiah as it's read. He's burning it in the fire because he hates the prophecies of Jeremiah. And then Jeremiah is told by God, hey, write another one of these. Write everything you said, I told you before, and tell Baruch to write it all down. So Baruch writes all this stuff down at Jeremiah's dictation, all the words of the scroll that King Jehoiakim of Judah had burned in the fire, and many similar words were added to them. This seems to be kind of like the book of Jeremiah up to that point. That is to say, this is like 20 years of Jeremiah's career that are written down, and they get rewritten down here and then added to. And it seems, the way it's written in Hebrew, at least, it kind of sounds a little bit like the end. And many words were added to them. Like, that's it. And this is what you're reading right now. That's kind of how that's how that feels. But then you kind of jump into another prophecy of Jeremiah's that has to do with Zedekiah in chapter 37. So, and then there are more stories. Jeremiah thrown in the well. That's chapter 38. So this is stuff that might have gotten added later, even after all that. Someone said, we're not done yet. And what's amazing about this is that you can kind of see these kind of books, like the book that gets rewritten and other things get added to them. In chapter 36 of Jeremiah, verse 32, that end of that chapter, that's what we're looking at. All these endings that keep getting added, we're kind of seeing this process of a scroll that gets rewritten and rewritten and rewritten, and there's 20% more added to Jeremiah in one tradition than another, right? And people are moving different parts around. All that stuff's happening up to the time of Jesus, and even after it. So all to say, we can see this kind of they didn't know what the ending was yet. Even Jeremiah dies not knowing the full end of the story. He knows there's going to be some hope somewhere. He knows there's going to be some judgment somewhere. But the scribes who continue to write and rewrite these things are trying to update the book so that the ending reflects what they know of God's presence in the world and God's actions in the world up to a certain point in time. Kind of an amazing thing to think of, like rewriting and supplementation and all this, helping to shape this book of Jeremiah well beyond Jeremiah's death. So to tie this kind of to the ideas of trauma and disaster that we've been talking about this whole time, there's not one definitive ending, and there's not one definitive kind of like, the end credits roll, right? A lot of movies work this way, right? Where there's like a tragedy strikes and there's kind of like one thing that fixes it, like somebody falls in love and then like everything goes away that's bad. That's not the way life actually works, right? You have to kind of keep going, and you encounter a renewed disaster every time that you encounter something new and different. That is to say, you're living. The past is always butting its way into the present and the future, and that the future is kind of impinging upon the present. So hope and disaster are always kind of mixed up. And I think this explains a lot of what we feel when we feel kind of sad when we get to the end of something difficult or after it. And we can feel kind of empty in a ways after we finish a struggle or something like that. It's like this almost kind of mourning its loss in a way. It's this really strange thing. But in any event, you can also think about Jeremiah as kind of this extended meditation on the exile itself, the disaster, which takes away meaning but also creates the space for new meanings, different meanings. Jerusalem can mean something different now. Messiah can mean something different now. The word of the Lord can mean something different now. It can mean a book rather than a prophet because of the exile. Those are some of the ways that God spoke into the world, that spoke into this kind of like unbuilding, deconstruction, created a space where there were new forms and organizations. We're going to see this happen in Ezekiel too in different ways, like the birth of the synagogue is going to take place. I'll explain that in the next couple of weeks. The synagogue being a group of lay people getting together to read the text and talk about it and pray together. A very different way of encountering God than in a temple. That sort of thing probably wouldn't have happened without the exile. So all to say, this kind of extended meditation on the reality of the exile, I think, is, and the unfinished quality of it, that it's always with us. There's Jewish theologians have talked about this for a long time. Have talked about the condition of kind of exile and diaspora, kind of the spreading abroad, never quite being at home, is the Jewish condition. But it's also that fact that they haven't found home is what has sustained them as a people in so many ways. I mean, there's amazing reflections on that, and I'll get to that a bit more when we talk about the return. So when we talk about 2nd Isaiah at the very end of this study, we'll talk about Jeremiah, then Ezekiel, then 2nd Isaiah, and that's when I'll talk about the kind of unfinished quality of coming home. So I'll push that into the future for now. But you can think about Jeremiah also as a script by which Israel is dealing with and confronting with the reality of its traumatic experiences of the exile, and can continue to deal with displacement, issues of feeling anger and rage towards God, feeling ashamed about where we are and who we are, feeling upset about the disaster that's happened, about injustices in our world and our role in it. We know from studies of trauma theory how much people need to tell their experience over and over again in writing and in drawing and in thinking and dreaming, and in photographs. They need to tell their story over and over again. And they tell it often in ways that are seemingly chaotic or disordered. But they say that, at least a lot of people who study trauma say that this kind of disordered and chaotic enunciation or articulation of what happened oftentimes reflects or mirrors the experience, the disordered experience that exists for those folks who have gone through trauma. Our words keep us from feeling alone, from feeling like no one else knows or no one else understands. And our words can provide space for others who have gone through similar experiences to help experience reality alongside of us and to know that they're not alone. In a way, these words can also generate a new reality in which we can all live. The words of Ezekiel and Jeremiah Their messages help shape the world that comes next. So in sum, Jeremiah performs in a way is what you can say disaster through its content, its broken flow. It makes moral agents out of us, the audience, by its unrelenting claims on divine justice, and by requiring us to kind of engage and make sense of its complexities, its difficulties. It also offers Jeremiah as a model and ideal survivor, a way for us to think about bearing witness to our own grief and the grief of others in honesty, but also to provide a sense of hope and that thinks about justice. And then it also helps us offer a vision of promise for the future. The book it doesn't give us that without all the other parts that come with it. I think it's really important for us in the church to think and to realize that if we want things to change, we can't just pretend like everything's okay. We need to admit what's happened. We need to admit things that have happened in the past, the things that we've individually done, things that we've corporately done, communally done, things that have happened throughout the history of Christianity, things that have happened throughout the history of our nation, things that have happened throughout the history of our world, in which we are in some way culpable, or that we've profited from in some way. This kind of moral reckoning and accounting from the book of Jeremiah. This is what all this isn't just me, but what Jeremiah tells us is that thinking of a hope and a future without reckoning with what's happened is destined for failure, and in fact is kind of an insult to God. This is what Hananiah, the false prophet, does, right? Just give them hope and dreams and cotton candy. And what Jeremiah gives people is reality that includes a need for repentance, space for grief, and then also hope. And that order is what we'll also find in Ezekiel, but in different ways. Ezekiel's got some exciting stuff that is very different from Jeremiah. We're going to have a different social situation, cultural situation. Ezekiel's in exile, writing from exile. Ezekiel is in a different kind of part of the community. Ezekiel is part of the central priesthood in Jerusalem, whereas Jeremiah was this kind of like side priesthood who had a long-standing beef with the temple. So Ezekiel's going to talk in different terms. He's going to talk in different ways, but he's going to have similar visions of judgment and hope. So I'm excited to get into that material. So thanks for sticking with me so far for the study of Jeremiah. Next week, we're going to shift into talking about the different social and cultural contexts of Ezekiel and what it was really like to be in exile in Babylon. See you next time. Peace.